books begin to get written, right? Fanning those flames. You saw other books down the line that were written as well. Next slide, please. And then when you saw the harshness or the legacy of slavery, the image that you see up in the left-hand corner is called the pear, like pear fruit, of anguish. And that was a torture device. And I want you to use your imagination of how that was actually used, right? This other device that you see behind it, it would be strapped around a person's head, and that metal part would be stuck inside of their mouth so they couldn't speak. At the top is a cartoon that was drawn, and it was supposedly done to strive to make fun of abolitionists, because in the West Indies there was, at a parliamentary meeting, there was an abolitionist that spoke about the type of torture that was used against enslaved people. And one of the things that they said on record is that an enslaver actually boiled an enslaved person in a vat of boiling sugar cane. And in order to make light of that, this cartoon was drawn to make it look like, yeah, that's not true. They're exaggerating. You know how these abolitionists just be making stuff up, right? And then down here, in the two images that you see with the red, I just saw those 2 days ago. I was in Jamaica, and I was visiting there, and I was like, oh, I got to bring that back and show, you know, the people some of the things that I've been actually documenting as well. This is actually called a body cage. And what enslavers would do is put a person in that cage where they cannot move and keep them out into the public. And it was used as a warning for anybody else that wanted to actually strive to thwart the authority of enslavers. But that didn't stop black people in Jamaica. Within 7 years, they had over 685 uprisings where they burned plantations, right? So that didn't deter people from resisting, you know, that type of system of slavery. Next slide, please. And this is something that was also popular. Black children as alligator bait was used in American popular culture in the 19th and 20th centuries and were present in a wide array of media, newspapers, reports, songs, sheet music, visual art. This was like popular culture during that time period. Like, why would you use children for alligator bait, right? It's funny, when you look at like directors or people who write horror movies, they're usually never black people that write horror movies, right? Because a lot of times we didn't have to try to come up with some creative way in terms of striving to depict death as an art, right? It's something that a lot of us actually lived through, and it wasn't fiction for us. Next slide, please. And this is important because D.W. Griffin, I'm not sure if any of you ever seen this film. It's called Birth of a Nation, subtitled The Klansman. And this is a film that was celebrating the Ku Klux Klan. So some of the things that I showed you the period between the 1800s, and now we're moving into the early 1900s. In the early 1900s, we have this film that was actually produced. And it's celebrating the Klan. The reason that you see the two white women in the middle is because the Klan, their whole idea was to protect the purity of the race. And who do you have to protect? You got to protect our women, right? Next slide, please. This film was screened at the White House in 1915. Screened at the White House. This is a quote from Woodrow Wilson, who was the president at that time. He said, "The white men were roused by a mere instinct of self-preservation until at last there had sprung into existence a great Ku Klux Klan, a venerable empire of the South to protect the Southern country." Right? So this film portrayed black characters, they were white actors of blackface, as ignorant and sexually aggressive. Now, you see the connection with that type of caricature being created about black men during the time periods of enslavement, right? That same narrative has been consistently advocated for generations. aggressive towards white women, the Ku Klux Klan or KKK is portrayed as a historic force necessary to preserve American values, protect white women, and maintain white supremacy. So this is the foundation when you're talking about the early 1900s. By the time you get to the 1930s, you have 3 million card-carrying members of the KKK throughout North America, right? Next slide, please. And this created what is known as Negrophobia, the fear of black men, right? And you also started to see lynchings that became like a pastime here in America, right? Where people would actually send postcards for lynchings. And when people were lynched, body parts, and I want you to use your imagination, body parts were actually severed from victims and kept as keepsakes, right? And this is a part of American history. Next slide, please. So where did race come from? One of the codifications of race can be traced back to this white anthropologist named Ernest Albert Hooton. So when I say white anthropologist, I'm talking about people who oftentimes didn't really have a deep scientific background, who were looking at studying the human family and things from an objective perspective. I'm talking about people who were traveling places to fill their cabinets of curiosity so that when people came over for dinner parties, they can pull out this and say, look, I got this monkey hand from over in this country, right? I'm not talking about actual scientists. It eventually evolved into an actual science, but I'm talking about people who had wealth and they traveled and they found little nice things to bring home and put in their cabinets. But this guy, in addition to helping establish Harvard as a center for physical anthropology in the United States, he was responsible for classifying human beings into groups and subgroups based upon phenotype, just physical appearance, through what is called comparative anatomy. Hooton used white people as a primary model of a man and classified and defined black and brown people as primitives according to this basic standard. Based upon Hooton's words, in 1926, the American Association of Physical Anthropology and the National Research Council organized a committee to focus on the anatomy of black people, so-called Negroes at the time. A year later, in 1927, the committee endorsed a comparison of African babies with young apes. If that wasn't enough, about 10 years later, in 1937, the committee published findings in the American Journal of Physical Anthropology to prove, not suggest or to imply, that Negroes were closer to primates than the white race. Right? So now, because this person is operating in this professional space or this industry, who's going to debate them? Right? So you started to see not only, like I showed you originally, the codification of what white is, now you're starting to see this concept of white supremacy being saturated into every aspect of society, right? So when you look at that act for suppressing the outlying of slaves in 1691, that's 85 years before this country started. So this is the foundation of this country being started. So when you hear people talking about, oh my God, America wasn't founded on racism. What? What you talking about? You obviously have not been researching or studying, right? Next slide, please. So because of this, you started to see black resistance movements that began to develop for change in every aspect of society. And this was the response to what we started to see, right? Some of the people that you see up here, you see Nina Simone. She did it in the form of music. You see Paul Robeson. He did it as a thespian, as an actor, but also an activist. You see Oscar Micheaux. He was a film director, right? Martin Luther King, Noble Drew Ali, the father Allah who started the 5% Nation. Elijah Muhammad, anybody familiar with Elijah Muhammad? He's one of the first people that just straight up called white people the devil. And people did not debate him or challenge him publicly and say, no, you're not, no. This is in the early 1930s when he started the movement of the Nation of Islam, and one of the foundations were white people are devils, right? Because imagine what he was seeing. Like I said, by that time period, you have lynching that is something that is normal in this society, right? And you have over 3 million card-carrying members of the KKK throughout North America. This is the environment that he's growing up in. So that was his conclusion, right? And we need to have a separate land for ourselves so that we don't have to live under this terrorism, right? Fannie Lou Hamer, she was an advocate as well for workers' rights. You have the Black Panther Party. All of these movements were the response of what was happening during that time period, right? Next slide, please. So what was happening is you move from that time period of enslavement, and then you get into segregation or legal apartheid here in this country, and black people are being attacked from all fronts. In the banking industry, you can't get loans, right? And if you do get a loan, the loan officer looked just like that. I mean, nowadays they don't wear hoods, but you know, that's how it oftentimes looks. The criminal justice system, public health, education. And keep in mind that when you have black people who are technically citizens or paying taxes too, but the money that they're paying those taxes to is not going back into their communities. It's not building their schools or providing them with resources and access to public goods like everybody else. It's going outside of their communities, right? Next slide. And then you have a person like Samuel Gompers. He was the first and longest serving president of the American Federation of Labor, the most influential labor federation in the world. And in the early 1900s, he franchised union discrimination and employment terrorism against BIPOC people, black, especially people who come from Asian countries like Japan and China, and especially in those building trades and construction trades, with the government's approval and funding. And that is a monument in Washington, D.C. right now that you can go and actually look at.